Hello, this is Rebel Heart Rose. This is the makeup for Wednesday that I missed because I was sick. I'm going to read 3 more chapters of Xena. The next one is a reoccurring character by Keith R.A. DeCandido. It had been a normal day at Métier's tavern, which was just the way he liked it. Within an hour of his opening, most of the regulars had come in. The ale flowed freely from the smooth wooden goblets into the patrons' gullets. The sturdy bar continued to withstand the onslaught of spilled drinks and clumsy drinkers. The 2 barmaids served the tables quickly and efficiently. The regulars knew not to mess with the pretty young women, and if anyone did, they were shown the door. A giant stag's head hung from the far wall, a gift from a local nobleman who appreciated the service Miltiades provided to the community. Taborn, one of the regulars, spilled his ale, laughing at one of his own jokes. As Miltiades wiped down that part of the bar, he smiled, extremely happy with life. Yes, it was a perfectly normal day, the latest in a series of them, until the stranger walked in. "Drinks for everyone on me," said the stranger, a young man in leather armor, carrying a broadsword on a hip scabbard. A ragged cheer came up from the assembled customers. Miltiades did not share in that cheer. An ex-soldier himself, Miltiades knew that it was never a positive sign for a tavern owner to have a soldier in an expensive mood around. Such people tended to break furniture and annoy barmaids. Miltiades hadn't had a brawl since the winter solstice, and he hoped to keep that streak going. Miltiades refilled everyone's drink before pouring an ale for the soldier. "What's the occasion, kid?" "Quite simple," the kid said with a grin. "My name is Roxas, but everyone calls me Rocky. Remember that name, barkeep, because soon it'll be known throughout Greece as the name of the man who killed Xena." Taborn, who was seated next to the soldier, turned his eyes wide. "The warrior princess?" Rocky snorted. "No, Xena the goat herder." "Of course, the warrior princess." Miltiades sighed. Generally, the customer was always right, but he couldn't let this young idiot go off and make an ass of himself. "Take my advice, kid. Go home and forget about Xena." "Are you kidding? I spent years honing my skills. This is my chance to prove myself against the greatest warrior of our age." "All you'll prove is that she is the greatest warrior of all of our age, and you're just some dumb kid who ain't got the brains to realize she earned that reputation for a reason." Rocky barked a derisive laugh. "What do you know? You're just a barkeep. You know how many times I've heard that Xena was dead? Killed by Callisto in battle. Killed by barbarians who hit her with a log. Killed by Ares. Crucified by the Romans. And you know what? It's bunk. All of it. Because Xena's unstoppable, I ought to know." "And how's that?" Rocky asked with a sneer. Miltiades sighed. "'Cause I tried. I used to live in a nice, quiet little village on the Parthian Peninsula. Then one day, the starfish fellow shows up and starts attacking folks in their homes. His boss was Xena. A bunch of us survived barely and decided to fight back. We didn't do too badly against starfish, but then Xena stepped in, mowed us down before we could blink. She gave me this. Miltiades lifted his shirt to expose the scar on the right side of his belly. When it was all over, the village was a pile of charred wood, and only 6 of us were still alive. I didn't have any family, thank the gods, but I had nowhere to live. I'd done fairly well as a soldier against Xena. Leastways, I survived, which put me one up on most of the others. So I looked for work. Finally hooked up with an arms dealer named Mezentius. That was a pretty good gig, mostly protecting shipments and the like. Went fine until Xena showed up. I'd heard rumors that she'd become some kind of hero. They turned out to be true. She busted up a scam Mezentius had going. I tried fighting her at one point and got knocked silly for my trouble. By the time I woke up, Mezentius was dead. Xena was long gone, and I was stuck. Working for Mezentius gave me some good contacts, though. Managed to score some work for King Xerxes, fighting some filthy rebels. It went pretty decently till Xena showed up. She helped the rebels out and deposed Xerxes. She gave me this when I tried to stop her. Miltiades pointed to the scar on his cheek. With Xerxes gone, I was out of work again. And working for a king who was overthrown by a bunch of rebels didn't exactly beef up my resume. I finally got work with a warlord named Nestor. That was real sweet until the big moron went after the Golden Hind. I thought that they were extinct. Rocky sounded like he didn't believe Miltiades. There was one left. Unfortunately, she was being protected by Xena, right? Rocky said snidely. No, Hercules. Actually. And that friend of his, Eos. But after Nestor went and got himself killed, who should show up to help Hercules out but Xena? I was starting to think she had it in for me, personally. Fine, I figured. I'd return the favor. I ran up to her, determined to take her out. It took her all of 5 seconds to take me out. She didn't even recognize me. That did it. I was fed up. It was time to get serious. By now, the entire tavern had gone quiet. Miltiades' customers were used to the barkeep listening to their stories. A long-winded tale like this was cause for notice. Besides, people always liked to hear stories about Xena. Pouring fresh drinks for everyone sitting at the bar, Miltiades went on. I spent the next month or so in intensive training. I went over Xena's fighting style in my head. I was pretty sure I knew her weak spot, and that the next time I saw her would be the last. A fella named Draco was building up an army. He and Xena used to run together, and they clashed up in Amphipolis after she went good. I figured sooner or later Xena would come after him, so I joined his troop. And it paid off. Xena tried to stop a slave trading scheme of his. I was thrilled. Finally, I thought, I get some of my own back. A bunch of us converted her and that Amazon sidekick of hers outside a temple. This was it, my big moment. After she hounded me for years, I was going to kill her. Everyone in the tavern hid their breath, even Rocky. She took me out without breaking a sweat. And you know what the worst thing was? She still didn't recognize me. We clashed 4 times, and she had no idea who I was. She just kicked at my leg and sprained it, and I went down in a heap. By the time my leg healed, Xena was long gone. At that point, I made a solemn vow. Rocky leaned forward. That you wouldn't rest until you hunted Xena down and destroyed her once and for all? Miltiades rolled his eyes. Do I look stupid? No, I swore I'd put as much distance between me and Xena as humanly possible. Blinking in shock, Rocky said, But didn't you want revenge for all the indignities she laid at your feet? No, I mostly wanted to sleep. Keep my feet from getting any more indignities laid at them. So I went to Rome. The Roman army's always looking for folks, and I was right. Got a job as a mercenary, put down some Germans and Gauls. Good, honest, steady work. And nobody'd even heard of Xena. It was great till I got promoted. What's wrong with being promoted? Rocky asked. Nothing, I thought. But they put me on prison guard detailing Rome itself. Prison guard? Rocky said with a curl of his lip. How's that a promotion? It was in Rome. Any job in Rome is a big step up from anything outside it. One day I come on duty and they've got some Gaul fella in the prison. And Xena! I couldn't believe it. Not only had Xena come to Rome, but Caesar himself captured her. They were planning to put her in the arena against the gladiators. I figured, great. All our problems solved. Then the Gaul tells me there's something I should know about this woman, meaning Xena, of course. I had no idea what he could be. What he could tell me that I didn't already know. Except it turned out she had a key. Next thing I knew, I woke up in one of the cells with a broken nose. And Xena was long gone. That was the straw that broke my back. I couldn't get away from her. No matter what I did, no matter where I went. I got beat up by Xena. It had to stop. I quit the guard and came back home to Greece. I'd saved enough to buy this place. And you know what? I'm better off. If I had done this 3 years ago, I wouldn't have all these scars and my nose wouldn't look like this. So trust me, kid. No matter what you do, Xena will stop you, Caesar. Caesar, Callisto, Draco, none of them could. And neither could I. Worst of all, she didn't even remember who I was each time she took me down. She won't remember you either. There was silence in Milited's tavern. Everyone looked at Rocky. Before anyone could say anything, a woman ran into the tavern. "Run for your lives! Bandits!" Then she ran out again. Milited heard horses at full gallop and voices crying out, probably the bandits in question. Then he heard something else, something he'd hoped never to hear again. 4.5 seconds later, a man in once brightly colored clothes went flying through the front wall of the tavern. He was quickly followed by another through the side wall. The patrons and the barmaids started making for the exit. Militant, though, couldn't move. He was in shock. "Come on," one of the bandits said. "Let's get her." Within a few seconds, both bandits plus 3 of their buddies came crashing through the walls. Then she came in. Xena. She had that same smile on her face as when she beat him up in the past. The smile stayed on her face as she walloped the bandits into insensibility and right into one of the supports for the tavern structure. As his tavern collapsed on his head, Milites cried out, "By the gods, not again!" When he came to, Milites saw Taborn standing over him alongside with another regular, Greycox. "Are you all right?" Greycox asked. "What happened?" "Xena drove off the bandits," Taborn said. "You should have seen it," Greycox cried. "Her moves were incredible." Miltiades looked around. He lay on the ground about 20 paces from his tavern, or what was left of his tavern. What was once a fine structure was now a pile of kindling. Shattered goblets, broken bits of bar, and the caved-in head of the stag lay strewn about the ground. Greycox carried on. Shattery let the bandits get away because she saw you were trapped. She pulled you out of there, made sure you were all right, and only then did she go back after him. It was amazing. She saved me? Militants asked, stunned. He felt something on his forehead, reaching up. He felt a bandage. "Well, of course," Taborn said. "I mean, she's a hero, right?" With that, the pair went off, probably to find another tavern to get drunk in. No doubt the other regulars were doing likewise. As Miltiades struggled to his feet, he was surprised to see Rocky approaching him. Miltiades assumed the kid would be off chasing Xena by now. "Barkeep," he said, "I just wanted to thank you. I have to admit, I didn't really believe most of what you said. I mean, come on, there's no way Xena could have gotten out of being captured by the Romans. That's just crazy. But when I saw her tear up your place, I realized that you were right. There's no way I'd even hurt her, much less kill her." Despite everything, Miltiades was glad. He didn't want this dumb kid to turn out like himself. Glad to hear it. "Of course," Rocky continued. "I'm not sure what to do with my life now. I spent the last 3 years training myself to stop Xena. Now that I'm not doing it, his voice trailed off. Miltiades looked at the remains of his tavern. You any good at construction, kid? Miltiades' tavern was harmed during the production of this motion picture. This is the next chapter, called Horsing Around, by Lynn McConty. Xena woke. It was mid-morning by the angle of the sun. Her mouth felt like the inside of a hen roost, and her skin itched with drying salt. She scratched absently, her eyes going to the slender figure that sprawled beside her. They'd made it to shore, but where that shore was, Xena was uncertain. The storm had blown too many days. At her side, Gabrielle rolled over and groaned. My mouth feels like a sandpit. Best we find some water. Thankfully, they'd left Argo with a friend before they took ship. The poor beast would never have survived. Xena flared her nostrils, searching into the light breeze for water scent. Behind them, tall, dark trees grew thick, spreading down almost to the sand's edge. They wouldn't grow so well without water. The breeze changed direction slightly. Xena nodded. I think there's water within those trees to the southeast. She staggered to her feet. The carry sack fastened to her waist, swinging with her movements up. She gripped Gabrielle's shoulder. The younger girl dragged herself to her feet and, leaning on Xena, made her way to where the scent of water became stronger. Behind them, Gabrielle's sack was left almost buried and unnoticed in the sand. Several hundred yards farther on and past the headland, within the edge of the trees, a tiny spring glimmered. The water ran only a few yards before it sank into the sand's edge and vanished again. Gabrielle flung herself full length and drank. Xena knelt, drinking from one cupped hand. The other lay curved over her sword hilt. We'll need something to carry water, Gabrielle looked back toward the beach. I had a water skin in my bag. I'll get it. The water had given her renewed energy. She dashed off. Xena sighed and followed. There was a water skin in her own bag, but she let Gabrielle retrieve hers. It would make the girl feel better to do something useful. A gentle smile curved Xena's mouth. The sort of smile few but animals, babies, and Gabrielle ever saw. It vanished as a sudden, cut-off shriek floated back to her. She should have known better. Any time her friend went out of sight, there was trouble. The sound of wood meeting metal smote her ears as Xena raced forward. On the beach, Gabrielle was fighting, her staff in constant motion. Xena slowed a second to evaluate. 2 enemies. One a smaller, lighter man who pranced, dagger in hand, around the edge of the fight. He limped. Gabby must have got in one blow, and the small man had no intention of receiving another. Probably he felt there was no need to anyway. The other man was huge. He wielded an axe with some skill, but Gabrielle, lighter and faster, was having no trouble staying out of reach. Her staff deflected the blows. Despite their power, But if just one of those massive blows landed squarely, she'd die. Xena moved in. The big man turned his attention to her. She opened her mouth to speak, soothingly. She suggested that there was no need to fight. Her eyes met his and she shut her mouth. Berserker, no chance of his listening to reason. They couldn't outrun him, and he'd fight so long as she or Gabrielle lived. She hadn't sought this fight. She knew Gabrielle wouldn't have started anything either. That meant the attack had been unprovoked. If two people had to die, Xena had no intention of allowing it to be themselves. She closed in warily. A few minutes later, the opening she awaited came, and her sword blade licked out. The big man went down, swinging his axe savagely in a backward blow at her as he twisted. Xena struck again. He snarled at her as he died. Behind her there came a high shriek again as the small man attacked Gabrielle. The girl's staff spun first one way, then into reverse. It cracked him hard across his knee, then came up to strike one side of his head as he half fell. He groaned and slipped to the ground. A fading glare transfixed them. "I curse you, May." His voice slurred before clearing again. "I hope she tears your hearts out, you." His voice trailed off as he shuddered and went still. Gabrielle would have knelt to check the body, but Xena snatched her back. "Wait. He could be faking. Let me." She checked the man swiftly. "No, he's dead." She glanced up. I suggest we collect your bag and get out of here. If this pair have friends, they may not be pleased at what's happened." She knelt, however, and checked belt pouches quickly. Her eyebrows raised at some of the items. Gabrielle turned to gather up the water-sodden leather bag. She swung it into her shoulder and followed her friend back to the spring. There they filled their water skins and evaluated the contents of the travel bags. They both had water skins, eating knives, and flint. Gabrielle's stock of her herbs was ruined, but her salves were intact. And Xena had her whetstone, spare dagger, and items to repair her armor. "I've got food, too," Gabrielle held up. "Half a smoked sausage and a chunk of hard cheese." Triumphantly, she looked down the seemingly endless line of trees and sand. Her smile faded. "Where do we go, Xena?" "I couldn't understand what that man said to us. Where are we?" "I'm not sure." She'd understood the dying words, but didn't want to say so just now. "Somewhere in the northern lands." Gabrielle blinked. "That far? The storm took us that far?" "I think so. Settlements here are often on the coast. If we keep walking along the shore, we should find one sooner or later, or a path that will lead us to one." She began to walk along the edge of the shore, where the sand firmed into earth under the tree fringe. "It's going to be cold tonight, without blankets." "I know." We'll light a fire. They walked steadily. There was no reason to hurry and exhaust themselves. Xena thought, if more trouble appeared, it was better they still had enough energy to fight. Toward late afternoon, her eyes noticed a thread of a path striking off into the trees. Gabrielle, she pointed. Do we follow it? We do. Stay behind me. She could smell smoke. It would have seemed a homely scent, suggesting a fire, hot food, and perhaps a bed. But for the undertone Xena was getting whenever the wind blew harder. Burned wood, yes, but there was more to it. She slipped through the trees, Gabrielle, a blonde shadow at her heels. Another guest brought the smell more strongly, and both women halted, then ghosted on. They'd smelled that scent before. Somewhere ahead there was death. A wave of Xena's hand, and Gabrielle drifted away to the left of the path. Xena went right. They closed in on a scene of devastation. They'd been a sturdy log cabin here once, perhaps as recently as 2 or 3 days ago. Now it was hardly burned. The body of the builder lay in front of the entrance. He died from one massive blow, which had crushed in his head and one shoulder. Xena moved to where the well-tanned hide curtain, which would have cloaked the doorway, had been flung aside. We have a blanket. We have to bury him. If we do that, I think would be fair to take anything we can use. Xena nodded, and for the next half hour, they sifted through the cabin's contents. They found a robe of rabbit furs, only slightly singed. Smoked fish and meat hung on one half-burned rafter. Candles, a coil of braided rawhide rope, another string, a good axe, and an ancient rust-eaten sword. Once they were done, it was becoming dark. We'll spend the night down the pathways, Xena said quietly. She'd seen the look on her friend's face. Gabrielle hadn't wanted to say anything, but the idea of sleeping by the body was bothering her. Gather firewood. I'll start a fire. Tomorrow we'll lay the man inside and burn his cabin. The ground's too rocky to dig a grave. The wolves won't find. Is that the way the people here do it? Some do. It's the best way we can manage anyhow. His gods will understand. Her tone closed the conversation, and Gabrielle went to find dry wood. Xena took a handful of the dry pine needles from beneath a tree. She heaped them into a tiny cone, added a sheath of dry twigs, and struck a spark onto the tinder. Gabrielle returned with firewood, just as the spark flared. Something caught her eye, and she gave a small crooning sound as she dumped the firewood. Oh, you poor little thing! She approached the tiny animal, making soft sounds of reassurance. It trotted to meet her. Oh, poor baby. Did you belong to that man? Xena had looked up quickly at the first words. Seeing what their visitor was, she had returned to the fire. With it burning well, she was free to look at the creature. Gabrielle was cradling a kitten. It couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 weeks old. It was a ball of black fluff with huge, innocent blue eyes. It cuddled into Gabrielle's arms as she brought it to the fire, purring at the warmth and looking up hopefully. It's hungry. Try it with some of that smoked fish you found. The kitten didn't have to be invited twice. It fell on the fish, ate hugely, then fell asleep in Gabrielle's lap while the two women made their own meal. We can't leave it here to die. How did I know you were going to say that? Well, we can't. Just so long as it doesn't cause us any trouble. Speaking of which, what happened down on the beach with those men? Gabrielle looked disgusted. I have no idea. I went to pick up my bag. They came out of the trees and attacked. The little one was in front, so I tripped him. I hit him on one knee, and he screamed. The big one went crazy and started swinging that axe. In her lap, the kitten had opened blue eyes and seemed to be listening as intently as Xena. I'd have tried to run, but I thought if I turned my back, I'd get a knife in it. Almost certainly. No, you did the right thing. I didn't want to kill them, but the big one was a berserker. Once they start fighting, they don't stop until they're killed. The other man was probably his shield brother. With his friends down, he had to avenge him or die trying. Gabrielle looked to where the ruined cabin was hidden by the dark. Do you think they killed that man? He was killed by an axe blow. It's likely. Remembering the man-sized cheap copper ring she found in the berserker's belt pouch and the right mark on the dead man's finger, Xena thought it very likely. The pair had probably made a career of robbing lone dwellers and chance-met travelers. It explained their instant attack on Gabrielle. And they left the kitten to die. That's awful. Xena smiled. I dare say they never saw it. Kittens aren't always stupid. This one probably ran away and hid. It came out when it saw you. It would, she reflected. Animals knew a sucker when they saw one. Or Gabrielle. I'll take first watch. She sat back to the low fire, a sword across her lap, and ears alert for unusual sounds. Warm under the fur robe, Gabrielle slept, the kitten curled up under the robe with her. It looked as if they had a traveling companion. Well, so long as it wasn't a nuisance. They were on foot. Carrying a kitten wouldn't slow them. It wasn't as if they had to be anywhere. She woke her friend at midnight and found the kitten joining her when she lay down. In the morning they ate. They went to do what had to be done at the cabin. Xena carried the body inside and laid it on the bed, onto the bed. In the limp hands she placed the old sword they had found. The injury they had slain the man had been struck from the front. Let his God know he died fighting. Unobtrusively, she slipped the ring back into the bruised finger. It fitted as if made for it, which, she reflected, it possibly had been. They heaped the bed and filled the cabin with pine branches. The resin would burn like a torch. It was as well the cabin was in a clearing. Xena had no desire to set half the forest afire behind them. She took one of the candles, setting it in a mat of tinder, then she lit it. Let's go. By the time that burns down far enough to start the fire, we'll be long gone. If anyone comes to smoke, I don't want them finding us still around. Gabrielle stood looking at the body. Her voice came softly as she stared up at the sky. The kitten sitting solemnly at her feet. We don't know your name, but we did the best we could. I hope your God understands it isn't your fault. If we were wrong, we'll take care of your kitten. Don't worry about her. She stood in silence a moment, then turned away. They shouldered their bags. Gabrielle scooped up the kitten, and they were off. Trekking along the edge of the shore toward the east, they walked steadily all that day. Toward sunset, they halted, moved into the trees, and made camp. No settlement, Xena shrugged. There'll be one sooner or later. We just have to keep walking. The kitten had scampered off into the trees. From the depths there came sudden kitten cries for help. Gabrielle was on her feet and running before the first one had died. Gabrielle, no, you don't. Shutting her mouth on the rest of the warning, Xena followed. She arrived in time to find her friend waist deep in a water-filled dip, retrieving a frantic and soaked kitten. Gabrielle looked up. I think the bank gave way. On you or the kitten? Xena's tone was dry as she hauled on an outstretched hand. Go back to camp and get yourself and that creature dried off before you both get pneumonia. She glanced around at the banks before she left after them. No sign of any slip. And the bank sloped into the water. Why hadn't the animal climbed out again? If it had fallen in, the night passed peacefully after that. The next day was more walking. Supplies would be gone very soon at this rate. They needed to stop and find food. Xena slept after her watch and woke to find Gabrielle looking guilty as she cradled a very round stomach kitten. What happened? She didn't know. It was my fault. I should have watched her. She was just hungry. Xena tipped out the bag. The last of the smoked fish and meat had vanished. Remaining still were the brine-soaked sausage and cheese. Clearly the kitten hadn't fancied the taste, although small tooth marks decorated the edges of both items, suggesting she'd sampled them in case. I'll go without. I made you bring her. I found rope and string at that cabin. I can set snares tonight. She eyed the defiant kitten. If we get too hungry, we can always eat that. Gabrielle opened her mouth to protest. I realized her friend was joking and subsided. The sausage and cheese are edible, but only just. They finished the last crumb around the fire that evening, after Xena had set her snares. Morning found empty snares and emptier stomachs. They walked most of the day, Gabrielle carrying the kitten, which had made their day miserable with repeated wails for food they didn't have. We'll camp here. It's only afternoon. I need time to hunt. There may be something I can find, and I'll set snares again. They both searched once they had settled on a campsite. There seemed to be nothing. No berries or nuts, no sign of anything edible. Here and there were traces of animals, but none looked recent. Once something moved, Xena pounced and stared down at her quarry. Fat lot of use that'd be to the three of them. At last, grimly, she set the snares and returned to the fire Gabrielle was tending. The kitten howled at her hopefully. "Did you find anything?" "Not really, but one of us can eat." She tossed the knife and beheld mouse corpse to the kitten, and watched the baby fall on the meal with growling enthusiasm. "There's good water. Drink as much of that as you can. It'll help." Replete on mouse, the kitten came to curl into her lap. "I may as well take first watch. Nuisance here won't like being disturbed." She settled herself back against a tree and watched as Gabrielle slept. At some stage, the kitten rose and wandered off into the trees. Xena looked after it. "I suggest you stay there," she said very quietly. "Except Gabrielle will keep us here for days searching. Besides, they'd have been out of food by now. Even if the kitten hadn't stolen what they had, they needed to find food. Too many days walking without food on this deserted coast, and they'd weaken." Gabrielle woke when her watch turn came. "Where's the kitten?" "Gone for a walk. She'll be back. Don't worry. If she gets into trouble, I'm sure she'll yell." She rolled herself within the door curtain and slept. Gabrielle sat alertly, her ears listening for sounds of a kitten returning. When that happened, there was no need to listen. It sounded like a cross between a cattle stampede and the infernal sound pigs made with something they called a musical instrument. Everyone else had other names for it. The woman had heard one once and agreed with everyone else. Xena came out of her curtain in one leap. Gabrielle was on her feet already, trying to decide where the sound was coming from. That it was approaching was not in doubt, but the trees tended to deflect sounds, so direction was hard to determine. The women moved back to back, just as shrieking kitten shot into the clearing and up a tree. Hard on its furry heels came a large, irritating-looking boar. It paused beneath the tree to utter a few heartfelt threats. Then it observed it had company. It had no time for them either. It accelerated straight for Gabrielle, who dodged hastily behind the kitten's tree. The boar plowed through the fire, spun, and returned around it to where Xena waited. She leaped to one side and drove her sword into the joint between neck and shoulder. The beast faltered. The kitten chose that moment to fall out of the tree. It landed under the boar's nose. The boar slashed, the kitten skittered sideways. Gabrielle hopped out from behind her tree, brought her staff down hard on the boar's skull, and vanished again. The animal's eyes rolled. Xena stepped up from behind and to one side of the beast, raising her sword again. The kitten shot forward under her feet, and Xena barely escaped, tripping over it. The boar emitted a grunting roar. Gabrielle emerged again, seized the kitten and Xena's sword, came down. The boar fell over. Everyone sat down to recover, apart from the kitten, who was playing king of the castle on the enemy's body. Well, we have food. Gabrielle's tone was tentative. By a miracle, her friend agreed. It is also a miracle neither of us is dead, along with that pig. If I didn't think it unlikely, I'd say your kitten led him right to us. Xena eyed the bouncing kitten dubiously. Maybe she did. To say sorry that she ate our food. At least we eat now. It'll be tough, but beggars can't be choosers. I do have some salt left. Help me drag the carcass away a bit. I don't want blood all over the camp. They skinned, gutted, and carved. Strips of roast boar proved surprisingly tasty. The kitten got her share, raw chopped for her into tiny scraps by Gabrielle. When they moved on a day later, they carried enough meat to last several days. Xena planned to try fishing once the meat began to run out. Once it did, they found the fishing wasn't bad, so long as they kept a very close eye on the kitten, who liked fish even more than they did. Gabrielle hooked the first one using a scrap of the boar, the string they'd found in the cabin, and a fish hook bent from a brooch pin. She placed it behind her, returning to fish again. She hooked a second, went to put it with the first, only to find the first fish was gone. Not that she had to look far. She left the kitten with its prey and tucked the second larger fish in her carry sack. It was quickly joined by a third and fourth. Xena emerged from the forest holding leaves pinned into a basket. Berries. How's the fishing? Wonderful. I've got a couple of good-sized ones. She pointed at the carry sack. Xena looked inside. There's nothing here. Gabrielle stood up. That! She followed the marks in the sand. Both fish had been too big for the kitten to carry, fortunately. At the end of the mark, she found the kitten energetically hauling a fish along the beach. Give me that. What did you do with the other one? You couldn't have eaten it. From behind her, Xena had begun to chuckle. She didn't. Look here. She buried it. I think she planned to come back and collect it later. The kitten flung itself at the uncovered fish. Gabrielle stood to pick it up. Xena seized the kitten by the scruff of its neck. Listen, friend, share. You won't starve. Gabrielle giggled as the kitten was lectured. The baby appeared unrepentant. It still liked fish. Days slid past as they traveled along the deserted coastline. Both women were beginning to wonder if the whole land was empty of people. There were plenty of fish, but the salt had run out, and saltless fish is tasteless, even if filling. At the high tide mark on the third day, they found a hollow and some rocks. It had once been filled with seawater that had since evaporated. The hollow now held rather sandy salt. They scooped up every grain with care, but signs of life or not, they kept up the night watch, which was just as well. On the 11th night after their arrival in this land, Gabrielle heard a sound. Her hand slipped out to touch Xena's shoulder. It was pressed in return. From the dark, 3 men came running. The fight was brief but ferocious. With 2 men down, the third gave back. Xena pursued. She didn't want him following them for however long it took to find a settlement. He wove between the trees, running like a deer, until she lost sight of him. Xena halted. It occurred to her it was strange. Gabrielle hadn't followed. In sudden fear, she turned and raced back along the trail. Gabrielle was sitting white-faced by the fire, staff in hand. "What's wrong?" "I think I sprained my ankle. I fell over a tree root." She examined an already swollen ankle. Xena bit back a groan. Gabrielle was still talking. "I'm sure if I bind it tightly, I'll be able to walk." Xena wasn't so sure, but she kept silent. The kitten crept out of the dark and cuddled up. Gabrielle hugged it gently. "You can't say she brought that lot into camp this time." "No, this time it was all their own idea. They'd stay in camp a couple of days. After that, she'd see if Gabby was all right." Gabrielle wasn't. When it came time to walk, the pain was so great, she fainted. She recovered to find Xena cradling her, thinking, "We'll have to stay here a while longer, but we need food. Will you be all right here alone while I go down to the beach and catch fish?" "Of course, we'll be fine." The kitten looked up and mewed as if in agreement. Xena found an unwilling grin stretching her mouth. "You look after her, small one. I'll bring you a fish." She trotted down the path, worrying as she went. They needed a horse, a pony, even a donkey would do. Something to carry Gabrielle until her ankle healed. She scanned the beach, then chose a rock jutting into deeper water. If she did well, there would be no need to leave her friend tomorrow. At the camp, Gabrielle was drowsing when twig snapped. She jerked upright. Too late. A nicely judged blow smacked against the side of her head, and everything blurred. Her hand dropped away from the staff. She saw a figure approaching, already unlancing hide breeches. She struggled to rise to fight. The kitten jumped from her lap. Dimly, Gabrielle was aware of a yell of rage. Footsteps crashing away into the trees. They did not return. She came fully conscious again sometimes later. Her head hurt, but that was all the injury she had. The kitten was sitting beside her, purring. How much of those events had she dreamed? She heard footsteps returning and reached for her staff before Xena came into view. "I got 5, all good fish. I won't have to." Her voice broke off as soon as she got a look at the camp. "What happened? Are you hurt? Your head is bleeding." Even as she questioned, she was kneeling to examine the cut. "Not serious. I'll clean that and salve it. It'll be fine." "You didn't try walking and fall, did you?" Gabrielle shook her head, gasping as the headache stabbed. "No, that man came back. The third one who got away last time. He hit me. I can't remember properly after that. He yelled as if he was angry. Then he ran off. It sounded as if he was chasing something. He didn't come back." "He didn't." "He didn't?" "No. He was going to, but whatever happened, happened before he did." Xena shut her eyes briefly. Thanks be to whatever had saved her friend. She busied herself in silence, cutting up fish to bake in embers. Gabrielle leaned back, concentrating on persuading the headache to go away. The kitten concentrated on the fish, purring what she was given a whole small one to herself. With that eaten, she scurried into the tree. She had something urgent to do. She was gone almost the entire night, but wandered back at dawn. With her came a horse, a short-backed, stocky animal without saddle or bridle. It was unshod, a sort of medium bay in color. "What do you think it belongs to?" asked Gabrielle. "No idea," Xena said cheerfully, "but it'll carry you to a settlement. Once we get there, we can let it go. The owner may find it." She broke camp, boosted Gabrielle and the kitten into the broad back, and with a length of rope around the horse's neck, led it off down the shore. A godsend finding a horse out here just when they needed one. She didn't like the way Gabrielle breathed. That blow on the head and lying on the cold ground until she came to had given the girl a fever. Xena pushed the horse, finally getting up behind her friend and riding as well as they could make better time. The animal was becoming lame when 2 days later they walked into signs that a farmstead was near. A long time ago, one of Xena's men had been a man of the north. She could speak enough of the language to have the horse shod. Clearly the beast had never worn shoes before, but the smith was used to that, and the horse was given no option despite vigorous resistance. There was no other mount to be had, but they could buy supplies now and a small amount of fever drink. Xena paid with a silver penny from the belt pouch she had looted. Then they rode on. 3 days more and they reached the outskirts of a large settlement. At the edge of a rise, Xena slowed the horse. She slid from the back, tethered it, and made camp back inside a screen of brush. Then she spoke. "Stay here with your friend. I'll get more medicine for that fever. Once you're well again, we can ride in and take passage out of here." The fever drink was easily obtained, enough of it for several doses. Xena rode back on the weary horse, left him enough rope to graze, and turned to Gabrielle with the herbs. They worked quickly enough. By the end of the next day, the fever was gone and the girl's strength was returning. Xena left her long enough to ride back into the settlement. The ship she'd heard talk of was in, readying for the passage back across the seas to Albion. She made arrangements. At the camp, Gabrielle was up, packing and chatting to the kitten. "You'll like it where we're going." She scooped up the small furry body and mounted the horse slowly, with Xena walking beside. They made their way down to the beach. "When will the ship be here?" "In the morning." The kitten dropped over the horse's shoulder. It appeared to vanish as small paws touched the sand. Under Gabrielle, the horse twisted. The shape shortened in body and legs, and a startled Gabrielle abruptly found herself sitting astride the black back of a naked man. She vaulted hastily away. He attempted to rise and howled. From where the woman stood, they could see the horseshoes securely nailed in his palms and feet. Both women recognized the missing attacker. Xena's sword lifted. From one side, someone cleared their throat. I thought it only fitting. He wished to ride you. Instead, it was he who was ridden. She chuckled softly. Go well, I will find a smith for this one. I think he would be rid of his shoes. Both women spun to stare. Nearby stood a tall, powerful woman. Blonde hair flowed past her shoulders in thick, glistening plaits and reached to the ground. She wore silvered armor, and at her side was sheathed a gem-hilted sword. Xena nodded politely. You were the kitten. Why? One cursed you in my name. I came to see if the curse should bind. I saw. You are one of my kind, battle daughters, ferocious in war, large in heart toward the weak. Your ship will come with the dawn. She extended her hand toward Gabrielle, who took it. The long fingers traced a ruin on the back of the small, calloused hand. Let the captain see that, she whispered softly. From the sky a chariot came sliding down, drawn by large cats. One winked at them. A wave of her hand, and the man was flung aboard. Go with my favor, battle daughters. A following sea and a fair wind. The chariot faded upward. Gabrielle stared after her. Who was that? Freya, I think. At least we're rid of that kitten. In the morning we can get out of here. Our own gods are bad enough. She grinned, although I don't think I'd ever seen anything sillier than you sitting on that man. Unless it was the look on your face when he changed. They were still giggling weakly when the ship arrived. The Hungry Land by Mary Morgan. Gabrielle tried to wake up. She knew that she slept, but this dream had gone far enough. In it, she dreamt that the earth had softened beneath her, and she was starting to sink. The soil covered her face grain by grain. In panic, she opened her mouth to call for her friend, and drew in a breath. Earth flooded in. She gagged on the dirt, and the noise that she made must have awakened her partner. Still trapped in the dream, she saw Xena rouse and walk over to watch while the earth covered her eyes, while it drowned her. But this was only a dream. She knew that. Very few of her dreams were prophetic. So why was she frightened? Gabrielle woke. Something hissed in her ears, and her neck ached. Carmine blotches floated in front of her eyes. She rubbed at their lids with her fingers. These felt cold. Their skin was like ice and was rough, with fine grit from the ground they had rested against. Worry, she opened her eyes. The sun shone full in her face. Though it had failed to warm the rock she was leaning against, hours must have passed. Trust me, I've dozed off again, she thought with embarrassment. Just sit down to rest while I wait for Xena. Close my eyes just for a minute and I'm away, she taunted herself. Though it was hardly surprising. She had been sleeping badly here on the plateau, waking exhausted and plagued by a nagging anxiety. 3 nights in all, each troubled by dreams. And she'd been dreaming just now. As she realized this, Gabrielle felt her heart falter, then quicken. I'm terrified, she thought, with amazement. But of what? She reached for a water skin to sluice the foul taste of her doze from her mouth and looked around her. So there was nothing to see but rocks scoured by the wind, hollows scabbed by gray patches of snow. She'd seen worse, so most of the provisions had gone. They'd survive, even Argo. So Xena had been strangely determined to take this route, although it was plainly out of their way. And so now she had gone on ahead, scouting, she said, though she'd sounded impatient when she told her to wait and to rest. So her partner was late. She'd be back, perhaps with a rabbit or two. So there'd be in dreams. Gabrielle stopped. She couldn't remember the dreams, just the fear it struck her again, so hard that she stuck in her breath. Cold air scorched her lungs and made her eyes water. Then she heard hoofbeats. Argo returning. She knew the mare's gait, and there was no one else foolish enough to be up here. She stood up and saw Xena riding with negligent ease, her face dour, but her partner was pleased. Even this far away, Gabrielle knew what that scowl covered. Relief. Even elation. Sorry about that. Now what? She asked herself and then waved. Deep inside her fear snickered knowingly. She ignored it, focused on Xena, who now towered above her. When the warrior, wordless, reached down a hand, Gabrielle took it, let herself be hauled into the saddle. Let's see what she's found, Gabrielle thought. A new feeling flowered inside her, and she knew it by name. A sense of foreboding. Xena rode for 2 hours, angling north. Away from there, sky slipped over her shoulder, through their shadows under their feet. Xena pushed Argo hard. Gabrielle saw with surprise the mare's coat had darkened with sweat. Her sides worked like bellows. Hey, she said softly, then tried again, pressing harder around the warrior's waist to get her attention. Patience. You'll see soon enough, Xena said. No hurry. There's plenty of time. Give Argo a break. She felt Xena take a quick breath and then shift. Her friend's knuckles briefly showed white as she pulled on the reins. Argo slowed and then stopped. Xena waited while Gabrielle slid to the ground, then swung down herself with consummate grace. Sorry, Argo. Xena reached down its skin, poured water into her hand, then rubbed it all over the mare's muzzle. What was I thinking? She said to herself. She filled a cupped palm with more water and let Argo drink. Gabrielle, watching, felt the fear flare once again and silently echoed the question. They reached it soon after. Gabrielle gasped when she saw. It's so lovely, she said when she'd recovered her breath. Words rose in a swarm in her brain. Numbly, she sorted them out. The land fell away into a crater that stretched past the horizon. The air rising from it was hazy, as though it were heated. It swelled into a dome that quivered and shook. Where it moved, rainbows crawled over its skin. When she looked down, she saw green, cushioned and vibrant, a pelt of lush green. Come on, Xena's face shocked her. It was so flushed. Race you there. The warrior turned, ready to plunge down the slope into the forest below, through a gap in the rocks rimming the crater. Wait! Gabrielle swallowed a tasting fear once again. What was going on here? A forest? Here on this plateau? With its fuzz of shin moss and its pool capped and crazed layers of ice? Something's wrong. What's wrong? Xena turned. Just once in a while, can't you leave out the pros and the cons? This is a gift, and you know what they say about gifts. Gabrielle did, though the horse she thought of was Trojan. It's well off our route, was the best she could do by way of objection. Everything else just sounded plain daft. It's north of our route, but we can still bear due west and take a break hunt. Make good our supplies. There'll be plenty of prey down there. Xena flung out her hand, palm slightly cupped, forefinger pointing. A conqueror's gesture, Gabrielle thought. The sort that gave statues. She tried to muster her doubts, but her partner abruptly got tired of talking, pivoted round on her heel, and bounded away down the path. Yes, there'll be plenty of prey down there now. Gabrielle flinched at the thought of wondering where it had come from. Her head was starting to swim. The rocks looked like teeth, which meant that the path was a throat, waiting to swallow. She shuddered. This place repelled her. But Xena was down there, in the tree's shadow. Gabrielle straightened her shoulders and wrapped Argo's reins around one of her hands. Defeated but dogged, she followed her partner, leading the mare, sinking into the crater. The sun shone strongly in her dream. If she looked directly over her head, she could see a blue sky all around, though the forest grew. She turned slowly, taking it in. Bark glowed like copper. Leaves hung like slices of emerald. Huge flowers seemed to float without weight, carved from ruby and amethyst, from topaz and pearl. Lovely but armored, Gabrielle thought. Each surface here would gash or bruise or pierce. A feeling blossomed inside her and rose in her throat. As it did so, the world started to spin. At first she thought she must have grown dizzy, but she soon saw the truth. The forest was moving around her. The shapes of the trees had all changed. Limbs crooked at their joints, straightened again, twitched and scuttled. Leaves became wings that unhurled, jeweled on the surface, dusty beneath. Compound eyes flickered shut and then opened, focused on her, judging the distance. As the forest swept down, she choked on the fear in her throat. Why was she so tired? Gabrielle hoisted herself to her feet and reached for her share of the gear, meaning to pack it. When she swayed, Xena looked over her shoulder from where she stood saddling Argo. "Sit down, Gabrielle." Gabrielle looked at her closely, then sat down. Cold coiled inside her. Xena's face had been blank. Perhaps there was nothing behind it, but Gabrielle trusted her instincts with Xena. She knuckled her eyes. What would be worse, to make a mess of her chores or to uselessly keep out of the way? Whichever she did, Xena would sickly fume. She stayed put and concentrated on the previous day. And considered the previous day. It had been hot. Perhaps that was why she had felt so wretched. And the air was so thick it clogged her lungs, shimmered with insects, was heavy with pollen. Trying to see through it strained her eyes. Anything further than a few paces away seemed to lie behind water or glass. Then this path was so tricky to follow. It wound through the forest and was easy to miss. Roots writhed across it, making for treacherous footing. Branches and briars snaked into her path, snagging her hair and her skin. Xena strode through all this, where Gabrielle stumbled and doubted the path. Xena trod it down as if on a conqueror's road strewn with petals. She left the mare with the bard and pushed on ahead. From the bounce in the warrior's stride, Gabrielle knew that Xena would have chosen to walk, whatever the state of the trail. She plainly loved it, the motion, the pace, the play of her muscles as they took on and vanquished the trail. She even defeated its shadows. Up ahead, where these lay thickest, they seemed to surrender to Xena's black hair and dark armor, so that she grew ever taller and stronger. Gabrielle had tired long before dusk. She had stopped for a moment, meaning to call out to Xena, but her partner had gone around a bend in the track, sighing, thrusting a hand through her hair, which was matted with sweat. The bard had moved on, trying to blank out the ache that burned in her muscles, her sides. She thought back with regret to the plateau, its clear, icy air, and lifted an arm to sweep sweat from her brow. Trickles dripped into her eyes, making them sting. Vision blurred. She had rounded the corner and seen with relief that Xena was squatting a handful of strides up ahead. Green light shone in a circle around her. Water lapped at her feet. A glade with a stream, somewhere to camp for the night, Xena said. There were fish in the stream, but though she felt hungry before, Gabrielle ate little. The fish had tasted like mush on her tongue, and she was exhausted. She kept dozing off, only to have Xena nudge her awake. The third time, Xena gave up. You can eat what's left in the morning when you feel better. she had said, taking the platter out of her hands. Now let's see to these. Gabrielle had looked down when she said that at her arms, at her legs folded beneath her. They were covered with scratches, most shallow and beaded with droplets of blood, but some deep. She'd been vaguely surprised because she'd not felt them. Now she watched Xena moisten a rag and dab at the wounds. She was taking her time, but Gabrielle sensed that she felt ill at ease. The bard flinched when she realized this, and Xena winced in response. All the same, she did not move any closer, but still kneeled only just within reach. And this morning, things had been worse. Food choked her while Xena kept even more distance between them. Gabrielle read rage in her partner and impatience, both barely tamped down. She will leave me, she thought in despair, but good sense denied it. She loves me. She'll find a way. Thinking this, although she'd been up for scarcely an hour, she felt sleep steal upon her, and the first smothered touch of a dream. The ground that she lay on was hot, getting hotter. A desert? She opened her eyes, saw sand stretch in every direction, but there were rocks here and there, and in their shade drifts of snow. She stood, and an icy wind slashed at her skin. She wrapped her arms around her waist, pulled them tight. Only the soles of her feet still felt warm. She looked down. The ground was dimpling, was shifting. It seemed pimpled and cracked. Out of the cracks and the pits, tiny black shapes heaved themselves up, many-legged, scrambling for purchase. They tottered and staggered, spread limp, dragging rags which soon dried. Stretching these, the ants swarmed and swirled, filled the sky. It turned the color of milk, shot through the rainbows. Though Gabrielle covered her face, she felt the insects invade her, clogging nostril and mouth. When she screamed, they filled her chest and consumed her. Xena kicked out the fire and smoothed soil over its remains. Through the mist, she could make out the sun's disk as it rose over the trees. It would be a hot day, she thought. Another hot day, she shivered. She shivered, feeling hairs rise all over her skin, and a jolt of excitement ran down her spine from her neck to her tailbone. But these conditions were taking it out of her partner, slowing Gabrielle's steps, draining her strength and her normal high spirits. Xena looked over to where Gabrielle was still sitting. The bard had fallen asleep again, her head lolling forward, her hands lying limp, palm up in her lap. Xena walked over to squat down beside her and gave her shoulders a vigorous shake. "Wake up now," she was saying as Gabrielle's eyes flickered and finally opened. "It's time to start out." "Oh," Gabrielle blinked. Embarrassment colored her skin, masked her unusual pallor. "Sorry, must have dozed off." She got to her feet, reaching out to steady herself. Then she snatched her hands back. "Xena?" The warrior fought to relax. What was this? Had she stiffened when Gabrielle touched her? "What is it with me?" She inquired of herself. Just now had she wanted to kick Gabrielle awake? And last night? She closed her eyes briefly, remembering how moisture had flooded her mouth, how her skin had grown hot as she swabbed away blood, how she had wanted to lick it. She shuddered, disgusted. Aloud, she said, I wish I could give you a rest day, but we have to keep going. She reached out herself, was relieved when her fingers made contact with Gabrielle's skin easily, willingly with no pricklings of distaste. That's more like it, she told herself. Must be this place. It's getting to me. The sooner we're out of here, the better, she said aloud to Gabrielle, as the bard stretched, then joined her in walking toward the mare. Yeah, what is it with this place? Why haven't we seen a single living thing except insects and trees? Gabrielle scuffed her toe in the dirt and looked around her, scowling. Xena looked too. The land opened up for a while and the path smooth. She could ride Argo. She swung herself up, surveying what lay around her. She still couldn't see far. Trees all around, and where there were none, brush and grasses sprang up, some as high as her head. And all this was up here, on this high freezing plateau. Yes, something was wrong, but she couldn't say that. Say what? So she shrugged and offered no other answer. The bard went on talking anyway, softly as though she was thinking things out for herself. It's so overwhelming, like it's in a fever, and it seems to be, well, so defensive. She kept pace with the warrior, planting her staff firmly into the ground, swinging her feet in a steady rhythm. Almost the old Gabrielle. Xena let herself smile, just a squirk of her lips, and just for an instant. No, the bard said, even more softly. Not defensive. It's aggressive. Ferocious. She took a few more strides. Xena glanced down at her partner. Now and then the reddish gold hair flipped back a little. She saw an arc, a pale cheek, streaked with dust. When Gabrielle was quiet, her mouth was shut tight. Little lines pinched its corners, a deeper one tracked up to her nose. Her skin shone with sweat. She kept her eyes down on her feet. I should stop, Xena thought. Should make her ride Argo at least. Worry ruffled the surface of what she felt for her bard, and she nearly leaned down, wanting to smooth back Gabrielle's hair, soothe her skin. Then a sudden gust of impatience overtook her. Weakling, she heard her own voice whisper inside her head. That's all she is. Why tie yourself down? Shocked, seared with shame, she rammed her heels inward. Argo leapt straight into a gallop. I'll scout ahead, she made herself shout back over her shoulder. But even while she raced away from the bard, something inside her expanded, spread its wings with delight. Soon she need Argo north, leaving the track. When the mare balked, blinded by grasses, she hammered her sides with her heels, driving her on. Foam spattered her legs before long, but she kept up the pace. The world was a tawny tunnel, of heat that turned here and turned there, shooting her through it. She laughed out loud, wanting never to stop. Then she came to a river and had to, though she ached to go on. For a moment she thought that she could and leant forward, but Argo tossed up her head, danced to one side, whinnied, and snorted. Xena leapt from the saddle and ran up to the bank, thrusting her hand in the water, scooping it up, splashing it over her face. At her side, Argo stepped up. Remembering barely in time, she grabbed the rein, made sure that the mare took her drink slowly. At length, Xena calmed, looked around. She could see the forest started again on the farther bank, and that since the river curved to the north, they need not cross it. She felt disappointed and watched the river sweep by. It was in full spate, tossing tree trunks, swirling them around in its currents. Xena knew how it felt, and feeling the same, she plunged in. Once over, she nearly did not return, nearly pressed on at a run into the forest. She knew she could keep going forever, make endless demands on her body, stay drunk on its heady response. At this moment, something jumped in the river, falling back with a splash. Alert, she turned back to its waters, saw the tiny commotion again. Trout. Her partner loved trout. Xena grinned, stepped into the waters, snagged herself supper for two. She swam back briskly, vaulted on Argo, then turned to go. Tamed and house-trained. Her voice sneered at herself. Don't you want to be free? She shut her eyes and rode back. Gabrielle was still walking. From a distance, Xena watched the small figure toil through its own dust. Something smote her, and she heard herself grunt in reaction. She rode down to the bard, who stopped and looked up at her, white-faced and panting. Xena sighed, then swung her up. I'm okay. Argo can't manage two in this heat, Gabrielle said after her breathing had steadied. It had taken some time. Her voice was blurred with exhaustion. Rest, Xena was curt. She tried to soften her voice. We'll all manage. She felt the small woman relax, felt her own tenseness start to grow slack. Impatience gripped her, a desire to be up and be running. Then Gabrielle's head settled into her shoulder as she slipped into sleep, and the warrior could wrench back control of her feelings. What's going on? Xena asked herself. Why do I never get tired while she just gets weaker? But the only voice that replied mocked her for betraying her strength by caring for weakness. Fighting it left her tired after all. In this dream, she woke to the sensation of being smothered again. I must be under the ground, the bard thought groggily, and tried to move her arms, to fight against whatever confined her. Touch told her, as well as the green light filtering in which she opened her eyes, that instead she was wrapped in thick, sappy vines. Heavy odors wafted from flowers whose vermilion petals drooped and laughed at her face. They had some darker fluid running through their veins. She had been left there. Perhaps she had even been bound. She felt sick with fear and with desolation. Choking, she bit at a stem that seemed to be trying to force its way into her mouth. Something that tasted like copper flowed over her tongue. A red spray spurted out, blotching her skin and everything in sight. Blood, she thought. My blood. Xena watched Gabrielle. Light from their fire's dying embers flushed the face of her partner, making the sweat glimmer. What had she muttered just now? Something about blood. Xena shivered. It was the second night now, while Gabrielle had barely woken since yesterday. The warrior had not slept at all. Hours ago she had made a fire, prepared tea and some food, forced a little into the bard, all the time fidgeting, longing to be somewhere else, anywhere else. Once Gabrielle had stopped chewing, had fallen asleep again as she sat there. Xena had barely taken the time to settle her down on her blanket before striding off. For a time, her desire to be moving had contented itself with circling their camp. But this didn't last long. She had felt like a horse on a lunging line, goaded into a gallop, but forced to stay always in the same place. She had made another circuit, then another, and then suddenly, helplessly, had given away, had raced off, back along the way they had come, scorning the track and its bends. She had plunged straight through the forest. Not so long after she reached the rim of stones that bordered this unsettling land, having raised barely a sweat. Now she was back, and still not at all tired. She was stronger, if anything, but she was very afraid. What had she been thinking of? Not Gabrielle. Not for a second during that run. Nor of herself, but only of running, of being free. She looked down at the bard. It would be so easy to leave her, to just turn around and disappear into the forest. But she'll die here, she whispered to no one. Then spare her that misery, someone replied, and her hand curled and strayed, hovered over her sword hilt. That way you'll be free. Yes, she'd be part of the forest, and free. She clenched her hand, stared at the fist she had made. Then Gabrielle shifted, twisted uneasily, and moaned. Old habit made Xena start forward and reach out a hand. The moment it touched the younger woman's hair, swept a strand off her forehead, her hand knew it could no more cut off itself than harm Gabrielle. This steadied Xena. She rested her knuckles lightly on her partner's cheek and hissed at the heat she could feel. The bard was burning up. Fetching her water skin, wetting a rag, she wiped Gabrielle's face gently, concentrating on the task, on the fact of Gabrielle's presence and her need. Gabrielle moaned again, muttered indistinct words, though Xena thought she heard her name. Then the bard groaned, twisted round, lashed out with her hands. Xena caught them, held them down. "Wake up, Gabrielle, wake up, it's only a dream." She said this again and again, and though it calmed the bard, she did not awake. Xena grew afraid. She never would. In the first light of dawn, she realized the bard's eyes had opened and met Gabrielle's feverish gaze. "Help me, Xena." Her voice was dry and frail like a dead leaf. "I can't wake up." In her dream, she was watching Xena run. The warrior ran endlessly, tirelessly, racing through dense stands of trees as though tracing wide avenues, not threading narrow paths. She saw her, it seemed, from every direction at once, as though she were a leaf on one of the trees Xena ran past, as though she were moss on a stone Xena's foot touched. Repletion swelled all around. Something had been excited. Something was being sated. The land gathered itself, ripened, grew more. Gabrielle realized she knew this because she was the land, because she had been eaten alive by the land. Xena readied Argo, strapping on their pack swiftly. She fondled the mare's ears. "Follow us," she whispered into the nearest, hoping the mare could. Then she turned back to Gabrielle, lifted her into her arms. The bard's eyes were closed once more. She lay quietly. Xena, dipping her head, could hardly make out a heartbeat. Panic rose inside her, but she squashed it. With Gabrielle in her arms, she started to run. The forest thickened before her. Trees stood against her, lashing out limbs, flailing roots. She ran on, dodging and turning, sure-footed in spite of its tricks. Then it changed its tactics, cajoled her, bled more of its strength into her, trying to drug her, whispering, "Be one with me. Share my strength." She tapped into that strength, fed it into her muscles, gripped the bard tighter, ran still faster. It tried to deceive her, turn the trail back on itself, meaning to swallow them both. "West is there," she said to herself, and forced her way to it. Then, when the land started to rise, she knew she was near the border, almost out. She breathed to her partner, "Hang in there." The slope became steep, and then steeper. Xena's feet slipped in soft soil, and she slowed, looked around for bare rock, and then made her way to it. She'd feel safer with that under her feet. She checked Gabrielle, feeling her pulse fast and faint under her fingers. Anger flared, and she lifted the bard, settling her over her shoulders. After that, using one hand and her feet, she climbed to the lip of the crater. There were stones on this side as well, tall and white. She started slow toward them, expecting to pass them in seconds, for the slope leveled off here, becoming a rim of black soil. But she couldn't get near them. One step, a second, then her feet rooted themselves in the earth. Light dimmed and time slowed. Her heart beat at her temples, shook her bones, which yearned to be free of her flesh. Gabrielle's weight bore her down, and she sank to her knees, settling the bard on the ground just before herself. Then she looked up at the sky and she screamed, "You can't leave!" The voice whispered to her when she was done and could hear it. "You're already part of the force. You soaked in its strength. It's part of you now." She stiffened as something behind her opened its mouth, prepared to engulf them. Xena sobbed. She looked at her partner's white face. "Turn around and come back," she heard in her head. "Be rid of your burdens. Savor your conquest." Its laughter mocked her. Xena stopped fighting the forest, allowed its raw strength to race through her. Her thoughts gathered power, ignited in starburst of flame. Through the dazzling eruption, she spotted a possible way. "I'll give it conquest." She drew out her sword. "It's revolted by weakness. Let it have what it wants." She tightened her grip on the hilt. "Feed it. Distract it." She brought the sword down, watched it part flesh, watched the blood spurt and soak into the ground. Summer began on the slopes of the plateau. Grass grew in patches down here, fine bladed and sweat, dotted with gentians and rock rose. Argo sniffed it and pranced like a filly, then rolled on the sward and sheltered quarries. Juniper dozed, blue-green in the sunlight. Rowan trees, rooted in clefts in the rock, colonized gullies above troubled streams. Lower down, silver birch clustered, striping the ground with their shadows. Gabrielle observed this intently. It helped to dispel the chill wisp of dream that still clung around her. These accused her, showing her winter come to the land high above, mist settling as frost overnight and fuming as fog in the mornings, ice licking the ponds. At night it was harder to fight them. Then she saw fungi dry to a crust and collapse into powder. Grasses bleach and wither, rattle and snap in the wind. Leaves brown and shiver, die and fall. "She did it for you," the land claimed in her dream. "It's your fault." Gabrielle would shudder and wake, afraid that it was. In a grove by a pool near the base of the plateau, Xena sat, perfectly still and staring at nothing. A breeze scented with wood smoke startled the face of the pool, making it flinch and stirring her hair as it passed. Gabrielle saw her push the strands back. Then the bard turned her attention back to their fire. Now that the water was hot, she could make tea. Steam drifted up from the cup. She sniffed at it, frowning. She picked up a small package and peeled back the wrapping. The comb that emerged was still brimming with honey, and she drizzled some into the tea. That was better, she thought, scratching her arm. 2 angry red mounds showed what she had paid to the bees. She let the tea cool just a little, then walked over and settled herself down by her partner, glancing up at Xena's face. Here, she held out the cup. When Xena didn't react, she said mildly, "It'll get cold." The warrior roused herself. She reached out for the cup and sniffed at it, then raised it to her lips. She took a small sip, then another, holding her peace. Gabrielle waited till she had finished the tea, then leaned over and took the cup back. Xena glanced at her. "Did you get stung?" she asked. Gabrielle displayed her arm. "Cheap at the price." She awarded her partner a cheerful grin. Xena studied the stings, then her face. "Thanks," her face relaxed a little. After a moment, stiffly, she returned Gabrielle's grin. The bard leaned back into her briefly, then turned matter of fact. "So let's change that dressing, okay?" Xena rose and went back to the fire where she watched Gabrielle assemble a bowl of hot water and some cloths. When that was done, she presented her arm, taking her time. Gabrielle undid the knot, then unwrapped the bandage, damping the innermost layers. She took a deep breath just before she pulled them away. The wound had been deep. She remembered its puffy, wet lips glistening red just below the rag that Xena had used as a tourniquet. But once the cloth was clear, she sighed with relief. Xena's familiar magic had asserted itself once again. The wound looked cool, the flesh around it healthy. A mere 2 days, and the thing was nearly healed. Gabrielle examined her neat little stitches carefully as she bathed them, sorting her thoughts. Xena's arm was okay. Now what about Xena? How could she get her to talk? In the end, she just said what had burned on her tongue from the moment she woke safely outside the forest. "Would you rather have stayed?" When Xena said nothing, she felt her eyes prick and then water. "Some help you're going to be," she railed at herself, appalled by her doubt and her fears. She kept her head down and felt tears slide down her cheeks, wanting to wipe them away but hoping the warrior would not notice. She was aware first of Xena's fingers gently catching her tears, then her voice. "The only thing I was sure I wanted was to stay with you," Xena was saying. Gabrielle felt herself smile and looked up to share it. But there was still more to be said. "Do you feel you've left something behind?" she probed gently. Xena's eyes went inward. "No." Then she dropped her hand, locked it tight in her other. "That's why I'm afraid, Gabrielle." Gabrielle leaned in as close as she could, wrapping her hands around Xena's. "Tell me," she coaxed. "I'm afraid that I brought out what I went in with, and that it poisoned that place. That what happened was me." Now she was weeping. Gabrielle tightened her grasp. "Say something," she screamed at herself. "Say something to mend this." She felt Xena shake and draw a deep breath, muscles tensing, ready to move. She'll run away just to save you. You've got to stop this. The words rose to her tongue without thought. You brought us all out, Argo and me, and yourself. It's you who saved us. I put you at risk. Xena kept her eyes on their hands, but stayed still. The darkness inside me felt at home in that place, and I didn't leave it behind me. I wanted to cut it out. When I gave the Force back what it had given me, I was trying to do that as well, but I couldn't. Gabrielle remembered the depth of the cut and shuddered. No, that place was the risk. Not you. I felt it before we even got there. So did you. She loosed one hand and used it to grab Xena's jaw, raised her head. When Xena was looking back at her, was paying attention, she said, if you had left anything there, I'd go back to get it, understand? She suppressed herself with her fierceness. Excuse me. Xena's eyes widened. Gabrielle, she softened. How can you say that? I mean it. Gabrielle made herself pause. This was too important to rush. You're not a good side and a dark side, Xena. You're not two people. A good one and a bad one. What you are is someone who has conquered your darkness, like you conquered that land. You wouldn't be you without it. She watched Xena take each word, considered it carefully. When she was sure her partner was ready, she added, and I love you, all of you, and then held her breath. Xena said nothing for a moment. Instead, she smiled widely. Then she asked, how did a new dressing? She lifted the arm with the wound, raised an eyebrow, managed to look rather like Argo demanding a treat. Gabrielle remembered to breathe. When she knew that she could, she replied, okay, hold still. Under Xena's incredulous eyes, she reached for the comb, dripping honey on a scrap of clean cloth. You planning a bear hunt? Xena asked, with me as bait? You remember the healer in that last village? She told me about this, said it stopped infections and made the dressing easier to take off later. I've been wanting to try it. Gabrielle looked up, realized that Xena had snatched back her arm. Humor me. She grinned. It's not as though you couldn't handle a bear or two. After all, I prefer it in tea. Xena grumbled, but she lowered her arm, held it out. There, Gabrielle said, when she had finished. All done. Who knows? Perhaps you've made medical history here. Xena examined her arm and her friend. Xena warrior guinea pig? Her voice sounded injured. Gabrielle chuckled, then, suddenly unsure of herself, dropped her eyes. I should have asked you first, she tried, for a lighter tone. I needn't put it in the story. Xena placed a hand on each of Gabrielle's shoulders, dipping her head till her brow touched the barbs. Nah, she said. We're in this together.